Our brief for today's session is a very broad one. We've got about 40 minutes for me to ask the panel for their insights and then take your questions. And this was our scope. Excuse me if I read. All too often, digital learning is designed for and used by those who already have an abundance of learning opportunities and credentials. How can more be done in the design, development and delivery of learning technologies to enable more diverse learners to benefit? At a time when digital access can unlock whole swathes of untapped talent, how can we ensure that it will? Is the challenge to us. One of our trustees, Jeff Greenwich, who's busy with the AOC conference this week, he offered his thoughts in a short video that we've put on our website, which I would encourage you to go and have a look at. His question to us is to explore how can we make sure that we're not just designing more for those that already have good access to learning? What can we do to offer equity of opportunity to those that are currently have-nots in this space? So, introducing my guests, Andy Turbefield, Head of Quality for Halfords Autocentres, Rick Gibson, CEO of the BGI, the British Games Institute, Kat Elliott, Technical Lead at Digital Unite, and I'm hoping that we will be joined shortly by Gary Izunwa, who's got a very long job title. He's the incoming founder at ZINC VC, a programme manager, outward and social mobility at the British Council, and host and founder of the Climbing the Rungs podcast, which again, I recommend. I'll make sure a link gets popped in for that. Really engaging discussions he's been having with people. And I've just lost Andy again, just at the moment where I'm going to ask him a question. So Rick, I am going to come back to you to start. So your project with UFI, Rick, has strong focus on making sure the games industry and games better reflect the diversity of our society. What barriers do you think we should be addressing?
So we run, every year we run an annual conference where we gather educators and employers to talk about career pathways and vocational agendas in games. And we also co-founded and run a festival for games careers that in its first year reached 40,000 people and involved 120 games companies and educators, all talking about how we encourage diverse people to consider games careers. So what we see are many points of friction where diverse people fall out of the funnel as they make their way towards games careers. Perhaps it's because the careers material isn't written in the right way. It assumes a base level of qualification or is jargony. Perhaps someone doesn't see anyone looking like them when they look at a prospectus for a company or a university or an FE college. Perhaps they've read about the games industry not being welcoming or seen some coverage of some very distressing Me Too moments that every sector has faced and have been in the public eye for games recently. Or perhaps they don't understand or haven't been communicated that even the best candidates must try many times before they find the right employer. So the result is the sort of chicken and egg problem that I know a lot of industries face, which is by the time candidates are ready to apply for jobs, fewer diverse people apply than are in the population. Okay. So what we decided to do was to challenge that chicken and egg dilemma by taking a cohort of young women of colour from our local community, training them using very accessible tools and helping them to create and publish games. So I'd pull out just a couple of main barriers that we're trying to overcome and how we're doing that. So first of all, it's see it and you can be it. Role models are critical for young people to be able to see somebody like them who's done it and who's made it. And so we're flying in role models who will be giving talks to our learners. And we're also facilitating our workshops. A young woman of colour is facilitating our workshops for those young women of colour. We're also looking at how do we tackle the cultural stereotypes in communities about the appropriate jobs, in this case for women. And the way that we're going to tackle that is by working with the communities themselves, which we've hired from in our wider organisation, to start to change and challenge those preconceptions about what women, what men, boys and girls would be able to achieve in their careers. There's the misrepresentation of diverse people in games, which happens a lot in all media, frankly. And that's very simple. We want more diverse people making more games. Technology poverty is a real issue, and so if we're expecting people to access high tech but they don't have it, we are overcoming that by our National Video Game Museum, which we run, has a workshop, and we are, with UFI funding, we're kitting that out with laptops so that learners can come into that space and use that tech. But we also chose a very accessible technology that you can access and create for free on mobile phones, which of course in everyone's pockets. Last two, and then I'll shut up. Safe place to learn. We looked at the data and we found that it's all very well setting up a course that people could access online, but if they don't have somewhere where they can quietly create, then they may not achieve the goals that you set out for them. So the workshop space that we have at the National Video Game Museum is perfect for that. And then finally, the low skill levels in some members of the community that we're targeting have very few qualifications. They may be from refugee communities, they may not have been educated in the UK. So what we're designing is an experiential learn by doing model, where there aren't any wrong answers, and where people work in teams, as we've heard from earlier today, to accomplish their goals. So those are the big barriers as we see them.
Which you're tackling beautifully through the project. I remember working some years ago on it with a games company I'll not name, and walking into their big open plan office and being the only woman of my age by probably 20 years. A very different environment, and because everybody was different from me, it's not an environment I'd have been comfortable working in. So there are issues in the workplace as well about, if we recruit people, how do we make them comfortable when they get there? But really insightful, Rick, thank you. Kat, I'm going to come across to you. That your organisation does fantastic work to support people to develop their digital skills. What models do you use to help people to get those skills, and have those been different with your work with people with disabilities?
Yes, they have, and in a really interesting way. So we traditionally operate a champion model for skills acquisition. So some of you will be familiar with that and some won't. So it's essentially a train the trainer kind of model. So we work with organisations, we provide a skills development platform in which we train their champions, and then their champions go on and provide the skills acquisition to the end learner. What we found, which was quite interesting and which actually led into our UFI project, was that the process of being a champion actually has itself a number of benefits. So it imparts a load of wonderful soft skills that are actually can be quite difficult to achieve through traditional kind of training methods. And so we thought this was particularly interesting, and what we were finding over the last few years, that we had champions who were then able to take those skills, for example, into employment opportunities that they wouldn't have had previously, because they have an evidence that they can organise their time, that they can communicate, can work with others and things like that. So we were keen to see if we could take that benefit and apply it to a very excluded group. And we decided to target particularly people with learning disabilities, who we know are extremely excluded from the workplace, but also highly excluded from traditional kind of skills development programs. There are some skills development programs out there that are targeted at people with learning disabilities, but the discovery phase that we did right at the very beginning of the project, really the feedback that we got from people with learning disabilities is they didn't enjoy that process. It wasn't a style of learning that really suited them. It was something that they felt they had to do rather than wanted to do. And ultimately the skills that they may have picked up in those sessions didn't really stick with them. So we thought there was, good potential in going, well, let's get a panel of people with learning disabilities to work as champions, so imparting digital and workplace skills to their peers, and through that process to acquire all of these wonderful, very transferable soft skills, and also a great deal of kind of confidence building as well, because that's a really big part of it for us. So we went into that with that mindset, and the first thing that we recognised is that we would probably need to quite radically reinvent the way that we deliver all of our online training. We'd never really done very much audience co-creation at all with our traditional audiences, let alone any new ones. So the first thing that we did was we partnered up with a specialist partner, a subject matter expert, who are a small outfit based out of the University of East London. and they develop quite a wide range of products for people with learning disabilities. So we worked with them, and they have a panel of individuals called their Purple Stars team, and we did a really user-engaged co-creation process. So we literally worked with this panel of people to figure out what we needed to do with our tech, but also figure out how to deliver the champion training content that they would need. And there was some really eye-opening stuff in there for us. I mean, there were things that we expected. So we expected to need to make our platform simpler and easier to use and more direct and all of those kinds of things. And I think we kind of knew that that probably needed to happen in general terms anyway. But I think the thing that really jumped out for us was the need for a much more self-guided and exploratory sort of manner of training. Traditionally, our online training is quite directed. It's kind of quite formal in nature. It's quite structured. And that's something that just didn't work for this group. You know, they wanted to be able to go and take away a load of really good information and just sort of sit in it and enjoy it and, you know, experience that information in their own time scale, without much kind of formal structure applied to that, no pressure. And then to come back into these nice group sessions and kind of play their learnings back, and to do that as often as they needed until they then felt comfortable to take those skills off and do championing with their peers to actually help their peers with their skills. And that's been a kind of a really significant piece of learning for us, I think, that actually that very exploratory mode of learning, and Rick, I think, mentioned, you know, learning by doing as a really key thing. So it's kind of really influenced, I think, the future direction of travel for us in terms of the styles of learning that we offer, not just for our learning disability audience, but actually for our whole user group and our whole learner group, to offer a range of both directed and more exploratory kind of learning styles, much more learning by doing kind of stuff, and to you know, offer those kind of differences of approaches. So that's been, you know, a hugely beneficial process for us, I think.
That's brilliant, Kat. That you know, UFI is committed to the design thinking way of working with our projects, real focus on users, on user design, on user engagement. And we'll be announcing next week, I think, the outcome of the VocTech Challenge, and there'll be a define phase in there, which is very similar to what you did in your discovery phase, which is challenge the assumptions that we think we know what our learners want, but do we really know?
Yeah.
And how do we find out? You only find out by talking to the people who it's aimed at. You can't guess what someone is actually thinking and feeling.
Absolutely.
So really, really important stuff, but very impressive, the work that you've done. Gary, welcome in the room. I'm hoping that Andy is going to be rebooting his laptop and joining us soon, but in the meantime, welcome.
Thank you.
I've been listening to some of your podcasts, very engaging. I have to take issue with a guy from Yorkshire who said there isn't a working class, non-working class. I'm a North Midlander, and certainly at Stoke, where I come from, the class structure is a very important issue in some of these things. But anyway, back to my question. Where am I? Yes. What's your perspective on how we can design and deliver better to help people to aim higher?
Aim higher, brilliant. Well, thanks, Hilary, for having me, and apologies if you hear some drilling sound in the background. You know, but working from home or working from remotely is a challenge. But I'll start with broadly thinking around how we can design better, and then kind of drill down on the aiming higher. So one of the podcast episodes that you may have listened to, Hilary, and thanks for listening in, by the way. Anyone that listens into one of my podcasts is held high in my regard. So I had a conversation with a young kind of professional called Renee, and the episode is called Growing Up Without a Computer. So she grew up without any kind of digital device at home at all. And what this meant was that when it came to things like doing your coursework or her coursework, let's say your English coursework, she would have to handwrite that, which is just, at least for me, who also comes from a less privileged background, was quite astonishing to also hear like the extremities of it. But when, you know, it got to the point that the school required it to be typed up, she would then have to go to internet cafes, do after school, do her coursework there, and then barter with the internet cafe owners on the prices that they would charge her for the kind of per sheet printing that she had to do. So, you know, it's just being cognizant of the fact that not everybody has the same level of digital infrastructure, and how to design around that to make sure that everybody is included. And a good kind of way that we can at least start to mitigate some of those challenges around mobile phone use. So a lot of young people may not have their own laptop, or, you know, they're sharing that with a myriad of people at home, but oftentimes they will have or can have their own mobile. That's thinking about how can we design our digital content, courses, programs, whatever it is that is going to be mobile friendly, so that it's digestible and kind of able to be engaged with on that format. Another thing that's really strong, really important to consider is whether the content that you create can be downloadable. So oftentimes, Wi-Fi levels or access to good Wi-Fi at home isn't available for everybody, but not at least in their home, but it could be elsewhere. For example, if someone's school has Wi-Fi, or even the local McDonald's has a Wi-Fi, is someone able to access those areas, download the digital content or so forth that you're kind of preparing and targeting at young people, which they can download it in that place and then consume and engage with at home offline, if that makes sense. So that's something kind of broader things to think about around how we're designing our programs or content or whatever, and how it can be more inclusive around people that might not have the same level of
Yes, it's a challenge. It came out for us very strongly in our green and white paper research that UFI can't fix the issues about bandwidth. That's somebody else's work to do, and very important work to be done. But what we can do is be really clever about how we design for those people who don't have the access.
Absolutely, that's exactly. I mean, there's only so much you can do around whether someone has a laptop or not, or whether the internet signal is strong, the Wi-Fi signal is strong enough. But there are ways in which we can design what we're creating that can still facilitate that engagement. And then around kind of aiming higher or aspiration, I would actually just echo a few of the things that Rick said. So you cannot be what you cannot see. But I think that is made even more acutely when you're coming from a lower socioeconomic background, because unlike race or gender, you can't necessarily see if someone grew up in a less privileged environment, and actually it's quite easy to conceal. And I can definitely kind of talk to the fact of when I worked in big banks and when I started my career at a big tech company, a lot of my colleagues were all kind of privileged people, and I didn't really want to talk about my less polished background with my colleagues. So it was very easy just to make it seem like I just fit in, and that's a challenge for younger people, because when they do come into more professional spaces, or if they're engaging with people, they might not be able to easily identify those people who have come from a similar background, because it's hard to spot, but it's also easy to conceal. So what's really important, I say, is, and a lot of work that I do, is to encourage people that have come from those backgrounds but are in now, they've made a bit of a transition in their life, to be really open and vulnerable about where they come from. It has a magical effect on other people, younger people, particularly from less privileged backgrounds, when they hear someone else who is in a position of leadership, or they've made that transition and they're open about their journey. For me personally, I grew up in a single parent family, low income, 1 of 5. I didn't meet my dad until I was the age of 9 years old, and up until that point, I could have walked past him on the street and not known who he was. And even though that's really hard to talk about, particularly on a public forum, I do so because I know that there's someone out there that might have a similar experience, even tangentially, and they can relate and see that actually, Gary did that, perhaps I can do it too. And I think it's really important to share those stories, because when someone else can see, well, not Gary, just the black person, but Gary from this low socioeconomic background has entered this certain space, I could also be able to do that as well. I might be able to aim higher and reach those levels or whatever. Not that I've ever, I'm anybody or I've reached any particular stature, but you get the idea.
Oh, but you're successful in your career, and being successful in whatever way inspires somebody else to also be successful.
Thank you, Hilary. Yeah, you can keep on bringing those compliments. I won't protect those. And then I think the last thing that was an insight that came from the podcast as well was similar to what Rick also said, is around the knowledge of available jobs. A lot of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds just don't know literally what exists in terms of labour market opportunities. So how can you aim higher if you don't know what there is to aim for? So there's a big challenge, or actually I'd flip it on its head and say opportunity, and how we can kind of democratize access, knowledge around what exists, but communicating that information and knowledge of available jobs through the role models who share those lived experiences, so that people know what is out there, but actually that someone as similar to me has done it, I can also do it too.
Yes, brilliant. And actually, the timing and the ordering of the guests has worked out perfectly, because that is the perfect segue for Andy, who I'll turn to in a moment. But Gary, would you put the link to your podcast, please, into the chat, so that the other people who are here can pick up on those. So Andy, technology challenging us again, but here you are. We just keep, resilience is one of those skills, isn't it, that I think is very underrated in all of this. It's the being able to get up when you've been knocked down in all things. But you're The question I was going to ask you really was, as an employer, about your challenges of getting a diverse workforce into Halfords who have the skills that you need. And some of that is going to be about people of different backgrounds than you're used to taking, recognising that there are jobs there that they could step into.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, diversity inclusion is something which is obviously very prevalent now, and everybody knows about it, or at least it's getting out there. In the automotive industry, we're quite backward. You know, we're quite behind the rest of the world in terms of getting on that bus. So it really begins with understanding where you are right now. So we're doing a lot of research at the moment to understand what the makeup of our organisation is, because ultimately what we want to try and be able to do is to have our business reflect our communities. Our customer, you know, in order for our customers to feel safe and to feel part of our business and being able to communicate properly, and for us to be able to do that, we need to reflect our community, and that's a big piece of work, because you know it's every part of D&I. And I think what's really interesting listening to the panel of what I've been able to hear while I've been having these issues is that it's about making disability an ability. You know, I think, you know, Ronnie Wilson taught me a little while ago that far too often we focus on disability when we should be focusing on what people are able to do.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we've been working. There's one thing that we spoke about a little while ago, and it's about, you know, you don't know what you don't know. And as employers, it's very easy to look inwards instead of looking outwards. And you only begin to find out what you don't know when you start to associate with other people that know more about this than what you do. And working with experts, you know, charities, people like yourselves, Ronnie and FST, really opens up your mindset to what it is you need to do and how far away from it you actually are. When you talk about training, you know, we deliver training in the same way as we've always delivered it. And it was only through working with Ronnie and charities and FST that we understood that some of our training didn't work. Because actually, when you're working with people with disability, they are quite open at giving you feedback about what works and what doesn't work. And that's how we realised that we need to change our training delivery to help people with dyslexia, as an example. And I think, you know, the work that we're currently doing in terms of really creating a true blended learn for people, using things like, you know, virtual reality, something which we've been working with FST to develop, really create safe environments for people to be able to learn in. And I think that's the other key to this. It's too easy to put people in a training room and talk at them for an hour with lots of PowerPoint slides. If you can put them into a safe environment where they can learn, then you can go forwards. So for us, you know, we want to create a much more diverse workforce. We're already on that bus. We want to bring far more women into our organisation than what we ever have before. And I will mention that, you know, last year our Apprentice of the Year that won our British Touring Car competition was a female called Jackie Hardy, and she came out as the absolute best person. So we've got a long way to go, but we are definitely on that journey.
And interesting, as you say, that one of the ways that you're changing is to spend time with people who are trying to do things differently. One of the things I loved about Ronnie's project was the way in which he just believes in people, and that what I want is for you to be able to demonstrate to me what you can do, and take away the barriers that mean that you can't show me that. So that you can succeed at the things that you can do, and the technology will help you to do that.
Ronnie has a great expression, which I will steal for the purpose of today, which is that, you know, people in wheelchairs, we lower the curbside for people in wheelchairs to be able to get across the road. What Ronnie's trying to do is lower the curbside for people with disability to be able to learn. And that's by creating new methods of learning. That's why, you know, virtual reality, e-learning, face-to-face, all of it blended together will help everyone to realise that opportunity to go out there and become employable. And that's very much what we're aiming to do. You know, we want to try and employ people because of what they're able to do as opposed to what they're disabled, what their disability prevents them from doing.
Yeah. Interesting that I think all of you have spoken about safe spaces and role models and being able to see yourself in places and doing things. Sally asked a question for Rick, which I think you've partly answered, Rick, but if you'd like to unmute and come back in, about how do the learners cope once they get into the industry, which can be quite pressured. So how are you preparing them for the softer skills side of the industry?
So it definitely can, and I mean I should say that we're right at the start of this process. So I'm not talking about graduates who've already gone into work. We're just ramping up. It's a massive problem in the industry. It's called crunch, and crunch will happen when, you know, as I've said in the chat, the unpredictable nature of creative tech development hits the reliable, predictable, scheduled marketing timelines, and it can result in companies just expecting their employees to work just way harder, and people start working crazy hours, and that's exacerbated by the passion that almost everybody who works in games has for their industry and for their products. That's probably the hidden secret thing that gets you a job in the games industry, is that you've got to love games. And people who are hiring for games roles will just see it as a intangible, irrespective of what you look like. Actually, it's sort of the way that you think and your passion. But I think that if you then add in lockdown, remote working, the games industry took about a week to deal with the pandemic. I'm being slightly facetious in that the industry just went virtual. The laptops were shipped out to their developers. Everyone carried on, and the industry carried on growing, and it grew like 12% in 2020, even more this year. Fastest growing creative industry in the country. Lots of people want to work there. But if you add in the impact of isolation, the fragmentation of team culture for games companies, and it turns into really quite a big problem. I think the way that you tackle it is for learning cohorts is that you start to manage people's expectations. You need to prepare them for what the work environment is really like. And a lot of university degrees that teach games development, there are 25,000 people in the UK who are studying games development degrees in hundreds of universities, hundreds of courses, schools of universities. Many of them don't teach you that games are made in teams. They're made by groups of multidisciplinary experts who are all adding their own thing into creating these wonderful multimedia products. And so we want people to be working in teams so that they are resilient to the problems that you face during development. And I loved all the discussion of problem solving that we had earlier today, and hearing from Caps Lock and others about that, because that's what games development is. It's a creative problem solving in groups. So I think that some of that you can manage learners in advance to tell them what the work environment is like. And we have a Future Learn course that we created a couple of years ago where we use video journeys of young people who have just started careers in games, and they talk about how they prepared for interview in their portfolios and what happened in their interviews, how they felt, and what do they do every day, mapped to the people who recruited them, which is a really useful sort of, again, quite an experiential way of learning what it's like to start a career in games. But I think you've also got to work with the employers. The employers have got to properly resource their games development teams. If you say we've got a massive deadline, you've got to put enough people on that problem to solve it in time. Otherwise, you're just going to expect people to work 12, 15-hour days, and then they burn out, and that's it, they're gone. In fact, and what happens is that the guys tend to come back, but women don't. Yeah. And so the average tenure for women in the games industry is about half of what it is for men, which is kind of actually quite scandalous. It's something that we don't talk about enough. So the games companies need to work on that. And I think that we have seen quite a lot of games companies kind of acknowledge that they've got, it's a very new working environment. They're all working. I mean, here we are in a Zoom conference, and that it's not going away. And I think that that's where bringing everybody together from the sector to talk about these new environments is really important. That's what we do with our summit.
Brilliant, Rick, thank you. Rest of the panel members, do you want to join in? Gary, this feels like this is a very fertile area for you as well, about encouraging, how do you get people who don't come from a socioeconomic background that is used to going to university, learning, moving on into those kinds of careers? How do you just support them to try something different?
Geez, I feel like, following off from Rick, he kind of says everything that I've thought of, and so no, which is brilliant. Kind of doing the job for me. So I don't think I have too much more to add on to that. Again, role modeling is extremely important, and just giving people kind of fair access to what's available. I think we've lost somebody.
Yeah, I just dropped off. I'm sure he'll be back.
Yeah, I didn't. So no, not too much more to add on that, I think.
Okay. Going to earlier part of our conversation about creating, about not wanting to talk about our own backgrounds as well.
Yeah.
Caps Lock on Monday in one of the sessions, they were saying that because of their experience as being parents and trying to work, they run everything between 9:30 and 2:30, so that particularly women with caring responsibilities can be there for their kids, can do stuff.
Yeah.
And it's those kinds of things about understanding what the pressures are on the learners, when can they come, and how can they come. We supported a fantastic project during VocTech Now for an organisation for domestic violence, and they had some really fantastic tricks. Like, one of their courses was, I'm not sure what it was, but I'm going to say macrame. It was something craft-based, but within there you were learning teamwork and skills. But a partner watching you do it wouldn't feel threatened by the subject matter that you were doing. If it was a gain some skills to get out of this life that you're in, they would have been very threatened. So it was that very clever use of content, building the soft skills into something that was non-threatening, I thought was an ingenious solution to that problem. And so another question from Sally. Any questions, please pop them in the chat, people who are watching in. Sorry, Gary, I cut across you there.
Oh, sorry, I thought we were asking a question. No, just something to kind of follow up on that. I think that is important when you're trying to engage people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, is to not be so rigid on it, but to talk about outcomes. I think a lot of the time, when we're thinking about what programs we're running or initiatives we're spearheading, it's the so what if I take part in this, like what happens, what's the kind of the outcome. And I think a lot of people, when you can be a bit more kind of, when you can produce or talk about the tangible outcomes of what, engaging in certain programs, initiatives that can be like that, I think it's a little easier for people to then either kind of sort themselves into or not into an opportunity.
Yeah.
So not being quite vague or ambiguous on anything, but being quite direct and kind of intentional with what the outcomes are of any type of course or program and what that will mean for them in their lives, I think is also quite helpful with engaging people from this background.
That's very interesting about self-selection being a problem. They don't even get into the stream to be considered for something. We had another question from Sally, that assessment can be such a barrier to demonstrating ability in reading, writing, maths. And do you see technology as a virtual, such as VR, as a way to removing these barriers? Andy, maybe you, and maybe Kat, would you like to comment?
I think certainly in our experience, as I was mentioning earlier, the sort of participation in something that allows you to demonstrate those skills in a non-traditional way has been of particular importance to us. So, through doing championing, somebody can demonstrate that they are a good communicator, that they can organise their time, that they can understand and communicate sometimes abstract concepts, that they can solve problems. So one of the big focuses for us has been making sure that we're building into all of our products and services ways to help our champions to evidence that they can do those things, so that then they can take those into conversations with employers, where traditionally the employers might be looking at a more traditional kind of skills questionnaire or aptitude testing and those kinds of things, which simply don't work for the audience that we're working with. They're a horrible experience to start with for most people, and all they really demonstrate is your capability at taking that kind of a test, as opposed to demonstrating real world experience of your capabilities in those areas.
We funded another project in your cohort, Contented Brothers, who have developed a difficult conversations trainer in VR in partnership with L'Oreal, because L'Oreal wanted to recruit more people who weren't graduates, because they saw the value in having a more diverse workforce in terms of the way they think, the route they've come up will give them different insights into the business. Yeah. And that was about putting them in situations saying, well, is that okay? How do you react to that? How do you feel about that? So L'Oreal can see if they will be able to get into the culture, and they can show that they're really good at this kind of stuff. So I'm conscious we are down to our last couple of minutes, and then we're going to go back into the main stage again. Is there anything that you guys were burning to say that I haven't let you say or haven't asked? All quiet. Andy, you have been a trooper, keeping on coming back in even when the technology is fighting against you today. So a big thank you to all of you for taking part. Please do have a look at Rick and Kat's projects on our directory. Gary's popped his link to the podcasts in the chat. And I think I will give us a moment to take a breather before we go back into the main session. So thank you all very much indeed for a really interesting session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Hilary.